Hi there, I'm Andrew Thomas. I'm on the SMPTE Toronto Section Board of Managers. Welcome to our event tonight. We've got 4 great speakers kind of covering different aspects of UAVs/drones, and hopefully they'll kind of give you a big overview of where things are going. Obviously, the use of drones in the industry is just growing all the time. I was in Vegas at Fry's Electronics on the weekend, and I was just blown away. There were 2 entire aisles dedicated to drones and accessories and that, and I just never seen that kind of quantity in a consumer electronics store. So tonight, the 4 speakers we're going to have are starting up. Yifei Zhao is talking about kind of the training aspects of things, learning how to become a drone pilot. We've got Jim Pengli from Transport Canada, who's going to speak a little bit to regulations regarding flying drones. And then Chris Basic, who has his own company and does a lot of production work for feature films and that kind of thing. So he's going to give a perspective on actually using drones in production. And then we're going to have a presentation from DJI by Patrick Moynihan. Our first speaker is Yifei Zhao, and I apologize, I'm not getting that pronunciation correct. So she is the operations director at Altex UAV and a program lead at Humber College. Throw it over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the final hour of first day of ProFusion. My name is Yifei Zhao, and as I was just introduced, I'm the operations director at Altex UAV, and I'm also the program lead for our partnership program with Humber College, and that's with our continuing education department. So I was told I only have 10 minutes speech. I'm gonna run the short version on general industry overview. So we're going to look at 3 things, starting with what is a drone, what is a UAV, and then we're going to look at why do people want to fly one for commercial purposes, and the last one is obviously looking at the operators out there, how do we succeed, how do we run safe and successful operations. So starting with what is a UAV or soon to be a UAS? Does anyone know what the acronym actually stands for? Tough crowd. So UAV stands for unmanned air vehicle, and UAS stands for unmanned aircraft system. Now UAV is the current legal term here in Canada, and UAS is the proposed regulation terminology for basically next year. So we're soon to change to UAS, which is aligning it with US terminology, and obviously also emphasizing on the system, on the overall system, than just the aircraft that's up in the air. Now, legally speaking, by definition, unmanned aircraft system. Technically speaking, any aircraft without a pilot on board can be defined as a UAS. So traditional remote piloted airplane, or the word drones actually came from military, so weapon grade, tactical grade, or the traditional recreational hobby users. So the question comes down to, when we talk about UAV or UAS, it's almost the same as talking about motor vehicles, right? It could be an 18-wheeler, it could be a sports car, it could be a commercial van. So the term is fairly large. And what we want to understand is what makes the current drones so special. Why is the industry so popular, and what's with the commercial applications? So what we want to look at is what makes us different from the traditional, whether RC or just traditional remote piloted airplanes. Number 1 is looking at flight characteristics. We have our position hold. So anyone who's recently flown on a 777, imagine if that airplane is given a position in air and tell it to hold position, it simply won't do it. But looking at any of the multi-rotor drones out there, they hold position, and they hold position fairly well. Number 2 is low altitude. So again, looking at traditional manned aviation passenger jet planes, they're flying at tens of thousands of feet above sea level. But the legal requirement currently for a UAS to operate is actually capped at 400 feet. So that's 400 comparing to tens of thousands, which is very substantially different in terms of the operational specifications. Number 3 is VTOL. Does anyone know what VTOL actually stands for? Vertical takeoff and landing. Again, looking at fixed-wing airplanes, you require infrastructure, you require actual taxi, runway, actual airport to support the operations. But with vertical takeoff and landing, especially with the smaller units, a lot of people even learn to operate, takeoff and land from their hands, right? Which you should wear the safety wear to do it. But really, it comes down to we require much smaller operations area. There really is an infrastructure around building a drone pilot, a drone airport, because we don't really need one. The last one coming down to why do we want to use the technology, which is coming down to our purpose, especially for motion picture, right? So we're really looking at for some kind of image capture and processing. That can be your regular RGB, it can be for infrared, it can be multispectrum, or even LiDAR cameras. But at the end of the day, we're looking for image capture and processing. And compared to traditional transport, where you're looking at a fixed-wing passenger airplane, they're concerned with how fast can they travel, how heavy can they carry. But really for what we want to do, if you're flying too fast, we're not getting accurate data. So our speed is a fraction of what traditional manned aviation actually travels at. So really at the end of the day, when you look at flight characteristics, we really substantially differ from traditional manned aviation. Which brings us to the next question is, why is the industry successful? Why is the technology so popular? Now, I always like to use the Ford Model T as an example because Ford Model T basically marked the milestone of automobile manufacture process. It increased the volume of car manufacture, changed it from a luxury item to a day-to-day vehicle that every family is looking for. So looking at the UAS industry, 7 years ago when we got into the industry, this was the first drone we actually assembled, which is just a little aluminum quadcopter. There isn't any image stabilization on it. So take a guess, 7 years ago, aluminum quadcopter, how much did this thing cost? Just a guess, wild guess? Close enough? In between, so it costed about 3,000 USD. 6 months later, we upgraded to a hexacopter, now has a 2-axis gimbal stabilization. Now again, to put this together, you have to assemble it. It's not out of the box ready to fly. So how much is this one? This was also 3,000 USD. So about 6 months later, we built our own heavy lift, and obviously now we get into $10,000, $20,000 just for the airframe alone. Now this is the most popular unit out there these days, and how much does this cost? 2,000, just a little over 2,000. Now you get 3-axis gimbal, you get 4K camera, you get a controller with it, and you get a couple of batteries with it too. So really, it's more of an integrated system. And in 2015, this thing sold over 1 million units worldwide. So really, I'm not saying this is the only unit out there, but I'm using it as an example because it changed the industry landscape. It really increased the user volume, which really boosted up the overall commercialization of flying a drone. Looking at the current industry landscape, who actually operates commercially? From survey and industrial sector, they're no longer just flying capturing RGB image. The images are actually embedded with the geomatics data. So they can actually get stitched through software, which basically marks survey, inspection, and mapping for various properties. For scientific and agriculture, there's multispectrum or hyperspectrum camera. So especially for agriculture, the application is fully autonomous. The data coming out from the drone itself actually gets processed into a mapping format, and that mapping format is actually acceptable by, let's say, a John Deere tractor. So a tractor is actually able to go out and run full autonomous agriculture operations. For law enforcement, at the beginning, a lot of people were concerned with privacy, with security, with the surveillance issues. Currently, the departments utilizing UAS technology is actually a lot of the traffic accident reconstruction, and heavy urban search and rescue. So especially for heavy urban search and rescue, they even incorporate with AI technology with the algorithm. So if you input the age, the gender of a missing person, and where they went missing, the program can actually calculate high probability areas to conduct search and rescue first. And for fire department, obviously they're using infrared to detect heat signature so they can better fight a fire situation. For film and TV, so many people weren't aware at the beginning of the Canadian UAS industry, film and TV was actually given the first round of standing SFOC, so standing permits, because a lot of the larger feature film and TV projects is all closed set, so less concerns with general public safety. We really started by flying for getting different angles and getting different perspectives, but nowadays with the technology, a lot of the challenges earlier pilots were facing, which is flying straight line. Believe it or not, a few years ago, flying straight line is actually very, very difficult. Flying a circle around a subject was very, very difficult. But nowadays, it's more about working smart than working hard. So work with the intelligence systems, learn to run your mission planning, learn how to set up for the machine to run the shots themselves rather than as a person trying to manually fly for the shots and having basically a bigger learning curve as a pilot. So just a quick comparison. From training perspective, we usually look at two aspects. Number one is how easy is it to train someone to acquire the skill set? And obviously looking at traditional manned aviation control panel and looking at what you would be using to fly a drone, it's needless to say the learning curve, the barrier to entry to the industry is a lot less than traditional manned aviation. And the other aspect we look at is how easy is it for someone to actually forget the skill set? Someone in the winter doesn't fly for 3-4 months. Do they still retain the skill set of flying? Which for commercial manned aviation is actually difficult. That's why they have mandated flight hours per year as a pilot. But really for a drone pilot, you're using tablet, you're using joysticks, which you use when you're playing video games. You can fly using your cell phone. These are gadgets and technology we use on a daily basis. So it's actually a lot more difficult for someone. It's almost like learning to ride a bicycle. Once you build a hand-eye coordination, it's fairly difficult to actually forget it. So from training perspective, this is no longer a commercial aviation pilot coming in, going through hundreds of hours of training, years of practice to build up a professional skill set. Now what we're seeing is working professionals, engineers, police officers, camera operators. They're already working in the professional field. And they're coming in learning how to operate a drone just like someone coming in to learn to operate a crane or learn to operate a forklift. Now it's simply an add-on skill set for continuing professional development. Now the last question comes down to, for operator perspective, how do we succeed? First couple of years when we started running training, the first question people come in to ask, why do you want to come in and get certification for training? So majority people come in is because, regulation asked me to come in and get my certification. So that's the first thing people think about is to get, regulation permit. But what we ask operators to look for, especially for commercial professional operators, when you learn to drive a car, let's say when you go get a taxi license, you don't look at MTO to say, how is MTO going to help me succeed as a taxi driver? And same thing as a drone pilot, you have to ask yourself from operations perspective, what do you really need in order to succeed? Where regulation represents the training aspect, but in order for you to run a business that's competitive, you also need to look at efficiency. How can you run your operations more efficient to save cost? And also at the end of the day, how do you actually deliver results? So all of those go beyond what regulation requirements are, which as operators, especially from the commercial sense, is we want to look at to achieve safety, efficiency, as well as delivering results to really succeed as a business. From training perspective, when we look at how to help the operators to actually achieve those goals, it also comes down to 3 sections, which is the current best practice actually guiding UAV operators. starting with equipment standards. I mean, obviously, anyone who's going to go out to buy a camera or buy, a set of lighting, you want to understand what limitations, what capabilities the equipment actually represents. And also similar to anyone who buys a vehicle, it's not just buying the vehicle, right? Every few thousand kilometers, you have to go for oil change, winter tires, or even checking your tire pressure, checking the lights, make sure everything is working before you go on the road. So very same as equipment standards of operating a drone. Just buying it doesn't take away your responsibility as an operator to make sure you continually to maintain it. So when you go on location, when you go to a job site, the equipment is properly managed, it's properly maintained, so you don't run into equipment malfunctions. Second is looking at human elements, looking at operators. Now, anyone who's familiar with general aviation operations, you'll know that piloting is a fraction of the operation itself. So to actually fly, you need to understand where you are flying, what you are flying, and setting up operators training, make sure they go through the learning curve. Just to be able to take equipment out of the box and take off with it doesn't guarantee you to actually capture the right data and delivering the results. Last one is workflow. It's standard operating procedures. So going back to film production or media production, we're all familiar with carrying a production binder, right? Call sheets, shot list. So very similar to flying a drone, you want to have some kind of workflow that guides you, that connects you as an operator to your equipment. So that's what really makes up your operations flow. And in that sense, I just want to mention a lot of people look at flight planning, especially not coming from aviation industry. A lot of people actually skip the flight planning portion. But if you look at it, flight planning for us is actually more important than general aviation, because general aviation flies from terminal to terminal. So when you fly from Toronto Pearson to, let's say, Vancouver International, it's actually easier to identify your airspace. That's international airport to international airport, Class C controlled airspace to Class C airspace. The airplane is not going to stop in the middle and says, that house is interesting, let me descend, figure out what airspace, and go capture image for the house. But really, for drone operators, the one place we usually don't fly at is airports. We don't fly from terminal to terminal. We put the equipment into our vehicle and we go travel to wherever the job site actually requires us, which actually may be different every flight day. It may be a different property, it may be a different filming location. So flight planning for us is actually more difficult because we're not flying every day from Toronto Pearson to Vancouver International. Every day may be a different location, which means you need to find out the airspace classification and find out who's your tower, who's your emergency contact. So workflow for us really is an important aspect of your overall operation. So at Altex, we look at what industry end user is really needing in order to connect them with the right technology and equipment. Where flight training is a part of it, but for organizations, government compliance is also important. And flight planning and overall workflow management also guide you as an operator to set up efficient operations. So our training is partnered with Humber College through our continuing education. And when we started, we simply were just running a Transport Canada compliant ground school certification program. And our students really brought more demand towards what they're looking for after they just get the theory ground school training. So we've also added our flight school, and thanks to the college, we also run different student support activities to make sure that operators are updated on technology, regulation updates. We're actually part of the training committee that also works closely with Transport Canada on releasing the training requirements and pilot examination. So we'll make sure our students stay posted on the industry updates as well. So my last note, and this is just to prepare Jim from Transport Canada. So I always like to say at the first couple of years, a lot of students are coming in and explaining to us their struggle with regulation process. I mean, obviously regulation is always going to be a bit slower than technology development. So I'd like to reference the automobile industry's development. Many people weren't aware that the first piece of regulation for cars is called the UK's Red Flag Act, which is a vehicle driving at maximum 8 miles an hour required to have a horse carriage in front of it, 30 yards in front of it, holding a little red flag. And obviously nowadays, looking at our highways, our road structure, our city development, there's movies, racing, and video games all around cars. So in other words, with regulation, it's our responsibility as actual industry operators to come out and share our challenges, share our industry experience with regulation to really help to shape the industry development. And on that note, that is the end of my presentation.
We'll have questions after the 4 speakers have got together. Just like to thank you very much.
Great.
Here's a certificate.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up from Transport Canada, just to kind of get a perspective on regulation and that, we have Jim Pengley, who I'm very grateful was a last-minute substitution. So thank you, Jim, for coming. And I'll just flip over to your presentation. Which one is yours?
Nope, not me.
Nope. That one?
That would be it.
There we go. And perfect. There you go. Thanks.
Well, good evening, everybody. I hope it's better for you than it is for me right now. I'm Jim Pengelly. I work at the regional office at Ontario Region at Yonge & Sheppard, and I process SFOC applications. And I'm going to try and give you truly a brief overlay of what the proposed regulations are and how that's going to affect you as a UAV operator. So we are the regulator. We have no redeeming qualities. We are the regulator. But what we're trying to do is what I'm going to be doing is trying to outline recent steps to implement the task force, the key work of what we're trying to accomplish, how the industry and TC can work together, because we don't want to be seen arbitrarily, even though we are, and where TC is heading. So I'm going to tell you about what we're trying to do in the future, which I think is neat stuff. Hopefully you will too. So where we came from is that Minister Garneau worked a deal so that Budget 2017 committed to modernize Canada's transportation system with funding to develop regulations for the safe adaptation of connected and autonomous vehicles, which is drones. I won't go into the rest of it. So Transport Canada is implementing Budget 2017 under these operations. So we have flight operations and technical analysis, and that's in the TC working group now based in Dorval. We have policy and regulatory planning and stakeholder engagement, and that's a UAV task force in Ottawa. We have engineering and certification standards that we're starting to develop. That's part of the task force in Ottawa. And service delivery through a center of expertise. That's going to be in Montreal as well. The service delivery, though, is still under discussion. And so the staffing strategy is going to include commercial, military, and student expertise. In reality, there's very little expertise because the UAVs is a new world to most of us. We come from helicopters and fixed-wing airplanes where we knew what we were talking about. UAVs is a new world to most of us. So now we have a dual role. We have to ensure the system, a Canadian aviation system. We have to promote aeronautics and innovation. But when we're talking safety, there's only 2 things that really matter. Manned aircraft are not affected, negatively affected, and the great Canadian public is held safe, harmless from what our operations do. TC recognizes a safe and responsible use of UAS by professionals, and that safety is a shared commitment between the industry and Transport Canada. The UAS is a departmental priority, but it's one of our top safety risks right now. We also try to provide a regulatory environment for the UAS that is conducive to innovation and economic growth. That may be seen as under dispute too. We seek to proactively and collaboratively address emerging UAS issues with its industry partners. So that's what we're trying to do now, establish partnerships with research, academia, film, construction, people in the know who know how to use the devices and can get more for their buck, but are doing it in a safe, professional manner that we hadn't thought of. So this is a color slide, and it shows the three things we're trying to accomplish and how we're doing it, but I'm not going to bore you with it. What we've done so far is support 2 pilot projects with the C-Hunter trials in the Alma range for beyond visual line of sight, and an extended visual line of sight by first responders at Bon Cher Provincial Park. The 2 UAS test sites are in Foremost, Alberta and Alma, Quebec, and therefore are beyond visual line of sight projects in the future, both by industry, by transport, and by the UAV manufacturers. The initial launch of the UAS Center of Expertise based in Dorval is to streamline and standardize the SFOC process, provide expert advice to regional inspectors, because right now we don't have any corporate knowledge. We're making it up as we go. And to monitor SFOC performance, and that's the safety aspects. The implementation of the interim order for recreational aircraft and the authorization of the RCMP with the development of training material and the development of enforcement strategy. The Mounties can now issue tickets to UAV operators who are in contravention of the CARS. We have augmented international collaboration with other civil aviation authorities. So we're not doing anything in isolation. We're working with the EASA, we're working with the FAA, we're working with the Australians on what they're doing and how we can use best practices. So the proposed regulations are that if you're a recreational user, it's a model aircraft. The micro category is 0 to 250 grams. We've done testing and discovered that the risk of injury is low, so we're not too concerned about them. We have very small, from 250 to 1 kilogram, and they're going to be part of the what you may or may not be issued an SFOC for. Because the problem with that very small is it's unlikely to be outside. It's likely to be indoors, and we no longer issue SFOCs for indoor operations. And then we got the small UAS, and that's broken down to limited operations and complex operations. Limited is in rural areas, no population. Complex is around airports, over built-up areas, or by an assembly of people. The regulatory proposal for small UAS, 25 kilograms or less, was published on July 15th, and it was open for a 90-day consultation period. The idea is that under the new regulations, we'll open up a brand new section of the Canadian Aviation Regulations, Part 9, and hopefully 2/3 of all the SFOC applications will wind up under Part 9, in which case I will not have to sweat blood to get you guys the authority that you require. There's clear requirements for each category based on the pilot, the product, and the procedures you're using. So the idea is that all UAV pilots must have sufficient knowledge of the flight rules, the airspace, and the safety procedures of their own aircraft to ensure safe integration in manned airspace for commercial operations. The pilot permit requirement is commensurate with the risk, the aircraft weight, the performance characteristics and conditions of the operation. Transport's looking at the idea of having attesters, and this attester is going to test the pilot on his aircraft or her aircraft to make sure they know how to operate it safely. The very small and limited operational category, the knowledge testing will be administered through self-study and online TC examination, and you'll be given a pass or fail. The small complex operations will be issued a pilot permit, it's probably through a formal knowledge testing. So you're going to have to show both a knowledge requirement and a proficiency requirement through the use of this attester. And that's what the implementation plan is like in bureaucraties. So we've done the 90-day consultation. We got about 700 submissions. Half the submissions had recommendations and suggestions. Most of them were polite. A lot of them were professional. So now we're reviewing the comments and seeing where that leads us. But the common themes are complexity, enforcement, and compliance. And that's about some of you with non-compliant aircraft doing complex operations now and having that stymied after the new regulations are implemented. The impact of the design standard on small or medium-sized businesses, the implementation of the framework, the pilot permits, the exams, the registration, all that's still in the works. The cost of compliance, the standoff distances, and the weight thresholds. The standoff distances is a real issue right now. I get a lot of comment on that because a lot of people find it distressing to work within 100 feet, outside 100 feet boundary of structures and people who aren't involved in the shot. So the summary of the new regulations, the original intent was a balanced approach to safety, integrate UAS in Canadian airspace, and encourage innovation within the important subsector of civil aviation. The future regulatory framework must be risk-based, flexible, and consistent with international partners, as I mentioned before. So safety, we want to further integrate UAS in the wider aviation system. We got to have NAV Canada be a partner at the table and to figure out a way of getting all UAS operators in the same airspace that I used to fly in, and you can do it safely. Both of us are reassured that we both know what we're doing and we're not in conflict with each other. Innovation, we want more predictable processes enabling innovation. We want the reduced administration burden alleviated for both our users and the regulators. Ontario Region last week issued an 1100th SFOC. There's less than 6 inspectors, 2 students, and a certification officer. So that's the workload we've had since January. So the SFOCs in the future will be based solely on the exceptions. Things that don't fit into Part 9, that's what the SFOC was originally intended for, and that's what it's going to go back to be done. And we have increased public acceptance. We want the public to be confident about if they see a UAV there, that it's there for a purpose and the pilot knows what he's doing. We want to be proactive instead of reactive. And so we want to work together. Engagement and collaboration is a cornerstone of the task force and essential to integrating UAS in our Canada's transportation system. The TC transport and industry have shared priorities to advance Canadian innovation, grow the UAS sector in Canada, address safety issues and promote responsible UAS use, and we also want to export it. We want to be the best business practice in the world and show others how to do it, and we want to export your technology and your pilots around the world, just like we do for manned aviation. So we have future forums that's going to be addressed this, working with the task force on these issues. TC will also review and analyze stakeholder comments on the regulatory package. We'll implement the regulations for the small UAS, 25 kilograms or less, operated visual line of sight. We'll further streamline the SFOC process and address regional standardization issues so that if you make an application in Ontario, it's going to be just as good when you apply in Prairie and Northern. There won't be a regional disparity because somebody's got an idea that no one else did. We want to foster safety awareness and address education gaps with key partners, and we want to plan for the future regulatory development of beyond visual line of sight and large UASs. So I've already worked with one operator on beyond visual line of sight on the Alma Range. We did another one in Foremost. Aragon's Labs did a test with beyond visual line of sight there. So in 2018 is going to, Transport will authorize selected BVLOS trials in specific use cases to advance common TC and industry safety innovation objectives, provide data both industry and Transport Canada to validate technology and create innovative solutions. What we're interested in is what works and what doesn't work. We don't want you to come to us with an idea, make it work, and then go and make $1 million out of it the next day. We want everyone to benefit from this. So that's how we're going to choose the partners for beyond visual line of sight. So currently there's no routine commercial BVLOS operations, but we're getting a lot of interest from guys who want to fly pipelines and guys who want to fly hydro towers as power line maintenance and inspection. In early 2018, TC will provide guidance on the identified use case scenarios and the expectation of safe operations. Other principles will apply when selecting authorized operations, which is what I was talking about regarding the partnerships. And of course, beyond visual line of sight has major challenges, and I'll let you read those because they're evident to you as well as to me. So again, that's what we want out of our partners. We don't want to make someone make $1 million and never hear from them again, unless it's me. I've earned it. So that's what the authorized trials are designed for. So I hope you have a wonderful thing. That concludes my presentation. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Jim. On behalf of SMPTE, just like to give you this certificate, and we look forward to having you back at the end just for Q&A.
Not a problem.
Wonderful.
Excuse me. All
right. Next up, from the production perspective, we've got Chris from Sky Eye Media, and I first met Chris on a set of a feature film. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say which one, but it was pretty impressive. He had two drones flying simultaneously, and it was very cool.
Hey everyone, my name is Chris Bassick and I'm the founder and creator of Sky Eye Media. We are a company specializing in feature film and television work using UAVs. Since 2011, I've had my SFOCs and I've logged over 7,000 flights and I have over 1,000 hours of flight experience. When I initially started the business, it was mostly doing real estate, some corporate videos and smaller stuff, but over time it transitioned into the film industry. In the last couple of years, we've been fortunate to work on over 20 Tier A productions. Those include some bigger series like The Handmaid's Tale, It, and Downsizing, which comes out this Christmas. Before I go any further, I'm going to show a little behind-the-scenes video that we put together a little earlier this year. Unfortunately, a lot of the footage is back from 2015 because we can't really show anything that we've done in the last year and a half still. But we'll have a good one coming out in the next month. So like I mentioned earlier, I started SkyMia back in 2011. It actually started in need of a summer job while in university. I had been working on a golf course for a couple of years, and the last thing I wanted to do was wake up at 6 a.m. in the summer again. So in September, when I went back to school, I bought a flight simulator, and for 15 minutes every single night for about 18 months, I practiced. And then after those 18 months, I bought my first helicopter, as you can see in the photo here, strapped a camera to it, and for the next couple summers, I was shooting high-end real estate up in cottage country. As a couple years went by, the helicopters got bigger and we moved more into the video world. This is one of our very first helicopters that carried a video camera, and we did some corporate work, mostly still real estate though. In 2014, we built our first octocopter, which is a 8-arm, 8-motor UAV. And in September 2014, we lined up our first film gig, and this was on a feature film called Pay the Ghost. At this time, we had absolutely no film experience, and this ended up being a Tier A film production, and we stepped on set not knowing anything. The very first shot that we did happened to be down a pretty big street in downtown Toronto. There was 100 background, 100 crew, and conveniently Nicolas Cage came out at the exact same time because he was part of the shot, and another 300 people came to watch. So for our very first film gig, we had 500 people watching it. It was extremely nerve-wracking. Thankfully, everything went really well, and we went home with a smile on our face. A year later, we built our Spider UAV. This is the one we still fly today. We have a few of them. I was planning on bringing it here, but it turned out to be too much of a challenge, and I gave up and left it in the parking garage. So I get asked a lot, what's kind of the process on a day-to-day, what happens on set? And I can tell you, even before we fly, there is a ton of paperwork. And this is usually, and it involves a lot of paperwork with the studio, filling out application forms of proving to them that you're going to fly the UAV in a safe manner, and then insurance. Insurance gets more complicated day by day, and every single production we work on, there's some sort of new criteria that needs to be filled out or completed. And it always seems like they only ask for these things 2 days before the shoot, and it's always a scramble, and it usually comes down to about the last minute before we get approval. Also, prior to showing up on the day of shooting, we have to do a scout to check out the location, make sure it's safe to fly, and more importantly, make sure that we're going to be able to safely and legally do what the director wants. On the day of filming, before any operation takes place, we conduct a safety meeting. This is where all the cast and crew comes together, and we discuss the shot, where the UAV is going to take off and land, and where it's going to fly, and then also go through emergency and safety procedures based on the location. This changes every single time, and this is also something we look at when we conduct our scouts. And then finally, pretty much any time you fly in Toronto, everything is controlled airspace, so we have to call in Nav Canada before and after we fly, but we do it so often that they usually don't even want to talk to us. So one thing I get asked all the time, and it's usually from different news companies asking for me to help them accomplish articles, is where does the UAV fall? And my simplest answer is it falls right between a crane and a helicopter. In my idea world, the best situation of UAV can be used in is combining both types of shot in one, a helicopter and a crane type shot. But at the end of the day, the UAVs cannot, and I don't think will ever replace a crane, and it won't ever replace a helicopter until UAVs become as big as helicopters. But the reasons they won't replace a crane, for example, is you can't save, especially with the bigger UAVs that we fly that are either 40 to 50 pounds, 6 feet, you can't safely fly these things within 15 to 20 feet of people, so you'll never get that close-up shot of someone's face. They produce a lot of noise. They don't get the same precision, especially in windy conditions as a crane, and you can't repeat the move, especially on a windy day. And then another challenge that we have all the time is with the 50-pound aircraft, as soon as you get lower to the ground than 20 feet, and it's in dusty conditions, dust goes everywhere. And then obviously on the helicopter side, right now they don't go anywhere near as fast and fly as long as full-scale helicopters. And in certain scenarios, directors will ask us to fly over neighborhoods at high speeds, replicating a helicopter shot, and just due to the nature of regulations and other complexities right now, it's simply just not possible. Other challenges we face is weather. Now, what most people don't realize, especially the bigger ones, is they can fly in a lot of wind. They will easily fly in sustained winds up to 35 kilometers an hour. Now, if you're trying to mimic a crane shot, that's where things get a little more complicated. The Spider drones we fly now, they can fly in the rain, but other challenges come up all the time because as soon as you get water on the lens, your shot's pretty much over, so you're pretty limited to what you can do in rainy conditions. Another question we get asked is, what do we like better, or what drone is better, the larger UAVs or the smaller ones such as the DJI Inspire 2 on the right? And the simple answer is there's a drone for every application. Now, typically, at least right now, we are finding that most of our film clients still want to fly the larger Red and Alexa cinema cameras with 5 to 6 pound cine lenses on them. So that's where the bigger helicopters come in, or the bigger UAVs come in. And another thing that I find when you look at the image that comes off the larger UAVs, because they are 50 pounds, when wind hits them, they don't get jerked around as much. They still do move, but the movement's much more natural and pleasing to the eye, versus if you look at footage from a smaller drone like a Phantom or something, unless you're on a pretty calm day, even though the camera stabilizer takes up the rotational movement, the lateral movement is still very jerky and just not as pleasing. But on the counterpoint, the Inspire 2 is an incredible piece of technology that flies forever. It's easy to charge. You can fly in tight spots, and it's actually making its way. It has made its way onto a few of the production we've worked on this summer. Usually only in daylight. Most producers and directors still want to use the big cinema cameras and big lenses at night, but every year it seems DJI is pulling out new stuff. So why did I get into the film industry? Two things. One, because I had the flight experience, and especially in this industry, manual flight and hands-on experience on the controls goes a long way, especially when you're flying in adverse weather conditions. And the second reason is I didn't want to be limited to flying in rural areas. Unfortunately, with the regulatory landscape right now, if you want to fly in an urban area, you need to be able to lock off the area. And conveniently, the film industry is one of those unique scenarios where they have the personnel there that you can lock down streets. They'll hire paid duty officers, and they'll do it right. So, somewhat what Jim is going on, I'm still a little bit worried what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months as regulations come out. There's the new compliant drone regulations that I'm potentially thinking will ground us next year if they come in as worded right now. I'm hoping it's not going to go that case, because I think it's going to be very difficult for small operators like myself to get our custom-built UAVs to the compliant status without doing tremendous amount of paperwork. I'm sure the fees won't be very high, but the amount of manpower to get it done will be. And then secondly, there's another thing in the regulations that are saying that, or trying to change it, that you need to give 7 days notice to fly in controlled airspace, which I feel like is backtracking and would be pretty much devastational to the UAV industry as a whole. I don't think this one's going to stick, though. I think this one will be pushed out. So where do I see the future of UAVs in the film industry? Like I said, right now, pretty much everything we do is manual flight, but I'm curious to see in the next few years if some of the operations we do become a little more automated, specifically for VFX work or visual effects work, where they need repeatable moves over and over. In my opinion, I still think a lot of it's going to be manual, because every time you do a take, actors move at different speeds, cars move at different speeds, and you need, at least in the short term, someone with an eye to adjust to what's going on in the situation. And the next thing is, will UAVs prevail? Will the DJI Inspire 2 make its way and become good enough that it'll take away all the work of the larger drones? And once again, I'm still not really sure about that. Even though the sensors are getting absolutely fantastic now, there's some complications with glass, flying anamorphic lenses, and at the end of the day, like I explained earlier, there's something to be said about a 50-pound drone versus the 7-pound drone. The smaller Inspire 2s fly absolutely amazing, but when you get into 35 km/h gusts and you're trying to replicate a crane move, it's not very easy. Finally, you'll see a picture in the right, and it was what Andrew was somewhat alluding to at the beginning when he met me. We were fortunate enough to work on a larger feature film this year where we were tasked to use multiple UAVs for lighting and camera work. And as you can see in the picture, there's a very high power LED spotlight on, as well as a camera on that drone. And during this feature film, we got to have multiple drones in the air at the same time. Look, keep an eye out for this one. It's an HBO and it'll be coming out hopefully in the spring. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. On behalf of SMPTE, thank you for coming. So we'll have you back for questions at the end.
Perfect.
Thanks. All right, so last up we have our speaker from DJI who's going to talk about some of their products. Patrick, welcome up, Patrick.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick. I'm a professional product specialist at DJI, and Chris was at the end of his presentation kind of talking about some of the stuff I'll be talking about, making drones much easier to use over the course of time. And as we saw in the Altex presentation, how complicated they used to be. Chris flies a custom drone that he built himself. But our idea of the future is to be able to open the box, turn it on, take it out, and fly it. And have it be easy and have limited training and experience to be a pilot yourself. So I'm going to go through and spotlight two of our most recent products and some of the new tech that was introduced. So to start out with the Phantom 4 Pro. So the Phantom series is our oldest and most popular series. The Phantom was originally introduced, I think, back in 2010. So DJI actually started as a college project. The guy who started the company was trying to task a flying or a UAV to return to home. So he built a flight controller, the Nausea controller, which was the first thing we sold, and that eventually turned into the Phantom 1. Now we're in the 4th iteration, and the Phantom 4 comes along with a couple new things. First and foremost, most of our drones now have an integrated camera made by us that's attached straight to the bottom, so you don't need to go out and spend any more money than you have to. The camera and the props and the motors are all included, no assembly required, out of the box, turn it on, be able to fly it. It's a 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor. Gives you a lot of latitude as far as dynamic range. I think Chris touched on this a little bit about some people still tend to use heavy lifters because they need the latitude of a Red or an Alexa camera. But cameras that we're distributing as of right now are getting pretty close. For instance, the X7 camera that we just released is a Super 35 camera. That's basically our cinema camera in the sky. But we still have not found a way to be able to mount a giant Panavision anamorphic lens to one of our smaller drones. So that's still the need for the heavy lifters there. We also introduced a 360 sense and avoid feature. So on most of our drones now, we have obstacle avoidance. But for the Phantom 4 Pro, that obstacle avoidance goes all the way around. Two optical sensors in the front, optical sensors in the back, IR sensors on either side. Make it very hard for you to hit anything that it sees. Of course, if there's a fishing line drawn across two trees, it's probably not going to see that. But as far as larger objects, it's pretty good at detecting them. Like I was saying before about ease of use, the RC comes with it, and there's also a built-in screen. Our batteries allow for about 25-minute flight time. And like I was talking about earlier, integrated camera, 1-inch sensor, all comes already built. And to give you a sense of what some of that footage looks like, being able to shoot 4K at 100 megabits per second. So we also have the remote controller, which also has an integrated screen. So yeah, just to harp on the point again, just everything's in the same box. Don't need all of our other products. You usually have to just use an iPad or an Android device with, but with this, it's already all attached. The screen's pretty great. It's pretty bright. It's 1,000 nits, a little bit brighter than most iPads out there right now. So it works in direct daylight. So also very easy to use. And as far as for broadcasting and outputting the signal that you're getting, we have HDMI port that allows you to put out up to a 1080i 60 signal. to any monitor, anybody who would like to receive the signal. We also send out a 720 I60 signal, which is what most broadcasters use, but I've known, like, just worked with Red Bull recently, and for some reason they think that using 1080-60 is the way of the future, but I know a lot of the guys still are sticking to 720-60. So as an example of the avoidance detecting, so those are the two optical sensors. They sense from about 100 feet away, and then will actually feather into a stop about 3 feet away from your obstacle. With the computer learning inside, it actually can sense and avoid. So it'll actually plan a route around something. So if it were to see a tree, it would see how wide that tree is and then plan a route around it. So like I was saying before, 2 optical sensors in the back, 2 in the front, IR sensor on the side. We also have a load of autonomous intelligent flight features. For instance, that video is our new draw feature. What that person's doing is actually just drawing a line and then pressing go, setting the speed, and the drone maintains that line. It really doesn't get much easier than that. So as far as autonomous flight goes, I think we're really leading the way in just making it as easy as possible. Manual flight's always preferred in my for the work I do usually. But it is nice to have these, like this draw feature, for instance. Also tap fly, which achieves the same sort of thing, where you would just pick a place on the screen, you touch something out of the picture, and then you'd press go, and the drone would, based on how large the object it's approaching is getting, would sense how close it's getting and then stop. You would also set the speed for that as well. We also have Active Track. Active Track is a very exciting feature. It's something that allows the camera, the drone, to process and follow you. You or a car or any sort of subject. It's based on a contrast-based system, so it would be picking me out from my background based on what I'm wearing, my skin tones, my shadows, and following that around. So not based on anything I was wearing. And then we have the Inspire 2. So the Inspire 2 is what I consider our crown jewel. It's one of our newest birds. We just also released a new camera for it. I mentioned earlier the X7 with the Super 35mm sensor. It's getting 6K resolution and raw Adobe ProRes and H.264 and H.265 codecs out of it. It's about a 7-pound bird, all in, aluminum composite shell, carbon fiber arms. There's 2 different prop styles. There's a high altitude prop and then a low altitude prop. Our dual battery system allows for 25-minute flight time. 25 minutes in the air is much longer than it has been in the past. I mean, and when I first started out, maybe 5 years ago, you would be lucky if you could get 3 minutes. So 25 minutes is getting to the edge of LiPo technology. It's a 6-cell LiPo battery, and as the years go on, it'll only get better and better. They're also 99 milliwatt hours, so you can take them on planes, which is important for most of our customers because they're traveling a lot, doing drone footage. 58 miles an hour in our sport mode, which turns off all the safety features, like that obstacle avoidance I was testing out. It's a lot of fun to fly, very easy to chase fast cars and that sort of thing. We also have a 20.1 mile per hour descent rate and built-in VPS. And by VPS, I mean our visioning position system. So most of our drones, or excuse me, all of our drones work with a GPS system when they're outside, of course. But if you guys look above you, there's a bunch of metal and a bunch of thick roofs and lights and all that kind of stuff, which basically the drone can't see through that. So what we have gone ahead and done is put these sensors on the bottom, 2 sonar and 2 optical sensors that actually are looking at the ground and basically picking points to kind of tether itself to the ground. So it's acting the same way it would outside, same stability in GPS mode, but just indoors based on what's underneath of it. And those work up to 50 feet. All new design. So to give you a up close and personal look, that silver card back there is our SSD. So that's what allows you to record that 6K footage in in a DNG format, in a RAW format, or Adobe ProRes, and that is 6K at 5.4 gigabits per second. So it's a lot of data. 15, the dynamic range is 15 stops of latitude, I believe. Dual battery system. Up to 27 minutes on paper. I always like to say a little bit less because things like wind and flying in sport mode like a crazy person also take off a couple minutes of life of the battery. And then those obstacle avoidance sensors that I was talking about earlier are right there. So those two little hammerhead eyes. And then in the middle, we also have an FPV camera. The reason why that's so important is the Inspire 2 is a dual-operated drone. By that I mean one guy's focusing on piloting the bird and not hitting anything, which is very important as far as drones go. The other guy is concentrated on the shot. So he has the live view out of the camera on the bottom, which is what's being saved to the cards. And then the pilot is focusing on that, I think it's 640 by 480 output of that camera right there. So he always knows what his bearings are and where the craft is headed, while the other guy can focus on what's really important. Ooh, a little animation. Didn't know that was there. Oh, I also forgot to mention that we also have IR sensors on top. So for instance, if we were flying in here, that it would sense the roof before you hit it and stop you about 3 feet away from it. So a lot of smart features packed into this guy. And last but not least, these are those vision sensors that I was talking about, those 2 sonar and those 2 optical sensors that look at the ground and take a picture and maintain that stability. And that's that FPV camera. So on the inside, we have our professional imaging system. Oops, sorry about that. Oh, I'll just talk about it. So our processing system is called Cinecore 2.0. That basically encapsulates our gamuts, our color profiles, and allows us to spit out that raw DNG sequence or Adobe ProRes. So to give you a sense of what your pilot will be seeing, that's our FPV camera, overlaid on top of what the gimbal operator would be seeing. So he has that, and that's always going to be the nose of the craft, because that camera is hard mounted onto the nose, where the gimbal operator would be seeing what, where the camera is pointed, where the lower camera is pointed. The intelligent flight modes for the Inspire 2. So this is where we really get into flight autonomy. Not only do we have a waypoint system, which allows you to plot up to 99 waypoints, and it allows you to change consecutively 15 different actions between those waypoints. So I can make an A to B 99 times, and in between that A to B, I can change speed, altitude, turn the craft, anything outside of flipping it upside down, of course. I can also pre-program it to come back home, and so at the end of my flight, it can come back home and I can change out batteries. So as far as autonomy goes, I can literally put in longitude and latitude points and then save those points and repeat them later. But there are variables, of course. If you're in wind higher than about 35 miles an hour, the Inspire has a little bit of a tough time keeping that precisely. But on a clear day, it's pretty damn accurate. So for our advanced flight modes, the ones that I think are most important are, of course, our active track modes. For instance, I usually operate this with 2 people, but for the single operator modes, we have active track, which allows the gimbal to actively track a subject while the single operator is just focusing on piloting. So it's actually leaving the gimbal, the camera, the processing to do the hard work with controlling the gimbal. So here's an example of Spotlight Pro. So if you look on the left, this is what the app would be seeing. So it's drawing a box around a subject and then just flying around that subject and allowing the gimbal to actually track that subject, just based on the contrast we were talking about earlier. It's incredibly helpful, let me tell you. Next is profile. So this is part of our active track features as well. So profile sets a distance between you and a subject, and it maintains that distance. So say I wanted to get a nice profile shot like this from 10 feet away. I would initiate the action from 10 feet away, press go, and then as my subject moves, the drone moves with it in profile, maintaining that 10-foot distance. It makes it incredibly easy to get a nice profile shot like this. Tap fly free. So how many of you guys are familiar with cable cams? A couple people? So tap fly free allows your drone to act as a cable cam. So on screen, you would press a point that you would want to go. So you can see me doing that in there, lovely hands. And so I picked a point out in the distance, and then the drone concentrates on flying, while I have control of the gimbal and I concentrate on the picture. So it's kind of the reverse of Spotlight Pro, where it's doing the piloting and I'm doing the gimbal operating. Last but not least is Smart Return to Home. So the reason I love Smart Return to Home, we've had a return to home for a long time. Return to home means that when the drone gets tired, it doesn't have a lot of battery life left. It'll come up to a point that you pre-program, a height that you pre-program, and then work its way back to you and land within about 5 feet of where you took off. But what Smart Return to Home does, it actually traces your path back that you took to get out to where you were. So say, for instance, practical application, you're in a forest with a lot of trees and you're weaving through these trees. What Smart Return to Home will do, will remember that flight path and then do it backwards and then land. So you don't have any sort of complications with possibly running into something on the way back. But also obstacle avoidance is on in Smart Return to Home. So even if something changed in between now and then and something were to be introduced into your path, it would sense and avoid it. So yeah, those are all the new tech specs. There are a couple other things that we're working on right now as for like pre-programmed shots. With our Spark, which is more of our consumer drone, we have being able to select a subject and then circle around them, do a droney, so which is just shooting out and still tracking onto the subject. But the future of that is pretty endless once we apply that to our professional drones. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to ask you to stay up here, and I'm going to invite the other presenters to come, and we'll have some Q&A from the audience. So I'll just redecorate a bit. But first, on behalf of SMPTE, thank you very much for speaking. We'll just redecorate. Probably easier if we just stand. All right, it's a cozy little space up here. Are there any questions from the audience? If so, could you please proceed up to the microphone? No questions? Okay, I have a question. So we were talking about the dual pilots, with the DJI product. Is that something that you do? Do you have a separate camera operator and drone pilot operator?
Yeah, whenever we show up on set, we show up with at least 3 people. You'll have a pilot, a dedicated camera operator, and then a spotter, or we call them a UAV safety. And yeah, there's pretty much at least in our world, there's pretty much no way you could do it by yourself. Maybe the odd shot where it's just a very typical straight-on helicopter shot, but anything dynamic with any type of panning movement, you always need a second operator.
Excellent, thanks. Now, you were just talking about the Smart Return to Home. I was just talking to a guy who produces a show, Mighty Cruise Ships. And their challenge was, of course, they launch from the cruise ship and the return to home, the home place, isn't the same as it was. Is there a product that can deal with that?
Yes. Actually, thanks for mentioning that, because I forgot to mention it. It's something new that we have been working on recently called dynamic home points, being able to change them as you go around, because I've been in that sort of situation too, where I'm on a boat and the boat is moving, and if it goes back to home, it is swimming. And as most of you guys know, you don't want salt water to get into it's just bad. But yeah, so dynamic home points is something that we just changed where you can program it to every couple of minutes, every couple of seconds, it'll change with you depending on your location, that it's actually picking up from your remote or from your iPad or from your device that's connected to, you know, everything that it's connected to. So yeah, that exists.
Excellent. Kind of as a group, I think this was kind of covered, but would you say that the use of UAVs, UASs, or drones has increased in the last couple of years, in the specifically on the production front? I don't know who wants to address that.
Drone production?
Do you think there are productions today that you know, 2 years ago wouldn't have even considered a drone?
Yeah, no, and I think that's actually our biggest challenge. Is it's an industry that's slow to adopt, I'm going to say, technology in general. And the only way we seem to be able to get on a new film or something, it has to come through word of mouth. It doesn't matter. It's nice that we have a nice website and everything, but a producer won't take the time to look at the website. It has to be a referral. And that's why when I got into this 2 years ago, it's not something I knew that was going to explode overnight, but every single film we've worked on, it just has been escalating over the last couple of years to now we actually have a pretty big client base that we've stayed pretty, at least this in the last 8 months, we've been solid.
Excellent. From a training perspective, obviously it goes well beyond the use of drones for production. What do you find that the people training are the applications they're using drones for?
So our program is through our School of Media and IT with the intention of training just basically media professionals, but we've actually been led by our students' demand. So about 1/3 come from professional engineering, surveying, some kind of industrial or construction applications, and about 1/3 actually come from law enforcement. We actually train majority of different law enforcement municipalities here in Ontario. What I find is actually interesting because when coming into the industry, we thought we knew every application there is. But about every 3 to 6 months, there's always a new industry coming in and says, hey, we have a new idea on how to actually use drones. So the new one this year is actually insurance adjusters, where they're flying for buildings after fire or after natural disasters, which is difficult to get someone up on the roof. So flying obviously makes it easier, and flying with the geomatics data, so the insurance adjusters are able to calculate the rooftop damage, and they actually, it's integration. So the software is actually integrated with the insurance adjuster software. So let's say the BC fire situation, homeowners got their house damage payout within really 30 to 60 days, which traditionally is a 3 to 6 months process. So it's really benefiting the day-to-day users now. And last week, we actually had our large regulation conference on the Canadian UAS, where actually DJI's Brendan Schumann from Legal Affairs actually brought up some interesting user cases where drones are actually saving lives. And he actually brought up, I think, somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 people that's actually being saved. Their lives are literally being saved by drone applications. So I guess those are the newer ones we haven't really thought about. So I'm really interested to see even newer applications coming out in the next year.
Excellent. Thank you. Before we wrap it up, are there any questions in the audience? Okay, if you can just step up to the microphone, please. Just tell us who you are and where you're from.
Kent Cousins from the CBC. So with the training, so this would be for our Transport Canada friend and the Altex friend, what happens to people who are trained now when these new regulations come in? What kind of cause and effect situation are we looking at with the changes that are coming down the pipe to people who are currently either getting training or have been trained and are currently working? What happens with them? Are they going to have to be relicensed? Are they going to have to be
They'll probably get a grandfather based on their experience. So you've already taken like the TP 1523, the pilot knowledge requirements test. So you've got that. You've got a record of that or a course certificate from that.
Oh, I'm not talking for myself personally.
Okay, I'm
as
sorry.
yet.
Okay.
But
so you've got a.
we'll see what your answer is, and then I'll make a decision based on that.
Yeah, I left the office a couple hours ago, right? I don't need that here. Okay, so the new regulations come into effect. A pilot presents themselves as, I've completed the pilot knowledge requirements, I have a course certificate from school, a training establishment, and I've got umpteen 100 flights on my platform. We say, cool, just out of curiosity, can you confirm it? And he will demonstrate it in some manner. He's got logs, he's got his own personal log, he's got his contract showing he's there. Whatever it works for him, okay? And we will say, great, here's your UAV pilot certificate. Go forth and have a good time, don't get in trouble. Because we're not trying to slow down the industry. It's going to be a horror show when the rules change, because we might have to reissue existing SFOCs that don't fit under Part 9. So there's going to be a balance between actively processing active applications and getting the guys whose SFOCs are no longer in force, the renewed SFOCs. So that's what's going to be our focus, keeping everybody operating legally.
Yeah. So okay, if you're in the air now, basically,
you're probably going to stay
probably keep going.
You'll stay in the air.
Let your certificates lapse.
There's no time permit on the certificate at this time.
I mean, SFOC.
Okay, yeah, that will ground you.
Yeah. All right. And from the Altex point of view,
Yeah, so if I can just add, and Jim can correct me if I read the CG1 incorrectly. So I believe the new proposal says there's going to be a knowledge exam, which is similar to the G1 you take. That's all going to be theory-based. And then if you want to operate in complex situations, you also have to have a test conducted by another authorized pilot or recognized pilot. So the question comes down to chicken egg question, right? So who are going to be the first wave of pilots who are going to be authorized to conduct or be authorized examiners? So I believe Ryan from the task force, his response was there's going to be the current operators who has blanket SFOC, who has track record. They're basically going to get through some kind of recognition from Transport Canada, and there will be the first wave of authorized examiners who are allowed to go out and run exams to approve the other pilots, so to speak. And then the ground school, I believe it's 60 months, so 5 years. If you've taken ground school within 5 years of when the new proposed regulation is released, then you get recognized for some part of your basically certification training.
okay. All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, we have one more question.
Sorry, just a quick question about the...
Sir, can you just tell us who you are and where you're from?
Oh, Luke from Course. I have a quick question regarding, and you kind of went over this quickly in terms of regulation. If you could just kind of expand a little more on license, what I would consider license exempt in basically an area which is more relaxed rules like rule. You're talking about the, so is there a license exempt for smaller kind of just pleasure crafts in a non-commercial setting?
If you're doing recreational stuff, non-commercial, then you don't need a license. We want you to take the TP exam on our knowledge requirements for a UAV pilot. That's for everybody. But you're not going to get a pilot certificate. No one's going to test you on your proficiency.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I'd certainly like to thank our four panelists tonight. I think we learned a lot. Also like to thank our partners at ProFusion. And please come, the show is on again tomorrow. It's actually closed for tonight, but it'll be back on tomorrow, I believe, between 9 and 5. And then for those SMPTE members, come out to our Christmas meeting in December. If you're not a member, go onto our website and sign up. Thanks and good night.